He didn't even flinch when he said it. He just sat across from me at my own kitchen table, the same table where I'd taught his wife to play cribbage when she was 9 years old, and told me that if I wanted to keep seeing my grandchildren, I'd need to start paying for the privilege. "Think of it as a family arrangement," he said, folding his hands like he was presenting a business proposal. $3,000 a month. First of the month, every month. That covers your Sunday visits and the occasional overnight. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked down at my coffee mug. Then I stood up, walked to the counter, and topped up my cup, even though it didn't need topping up. I needed 5 seconds to decide what kind of man I was going to be in that moment. I chose patient. I chose quiet. And I chose to let him believe, for just a little while longer, that he had won. "I'll think about it," I said. He smiled like he already knew the answer. He didn't know me at all. "My name is Gary Whitfield. I'm 63 years old. I live in Guelph, Ontario, and for 31 years I worked as a licensed electrician before my knees and my lower back decided to hold a joint press conference and announce their retirement. My wife, Carol, passed away from ovarian cancer 11 years ago. And it's the kind of loss you never fully come back from. You just learn to carry it differently as the years go on. We had one daughter together, Meg. She came into the world loud and opinionated and curious about everything, and she never really changed. Carol used to say Meg got her stubbornness from me and her charm from her. I never argued. She was probably right on both counts. Meg grew up in the house. I still live in a 2-story brick place on a quiet street with a backyard big enough for a garden and a garage I converted into a workshop. Carol planted rose bushes along the side fence the spring before she got sick, and I've kept them going every year since. Pruning them each May is the closest thing I have to a conversation with her anymore. When Meg was 26, she met a man named Trevor at a work event in Kitchener. He was 31, managed logistics for a mid-sized distribution company, and he had the kind of easy confidence that reads as charming in the short term and controlling in the long term. I didn't see it right away. Most fathers don't. You want your daughter to be happy. You give people the benefit of the doubt. You tell yourself you're not the type to interfere. They dated for 2 years, got engaged, and were married on a warm Saturday in September. Meg looked beautiful. Trevor looked pleased with himself. I walked her down the aisle and cried and told myself I was being foolish, that every father feels this way, that I just needed time to adjust. They bought a house in Cambridge about 40 minutes from me, and within 2 years, Meg was pregnant with their first child, a girl. They named her Nora. I was at the hospital the night Nora was born. I held her when she was 40 minutes old, and I felt something I hadn't felt since Carol died, a sense that the future was something to look forward to, not just something to get through. 13 months after Nora arrived, Meg had a second daughter. They named her Paige. For the first couple of years, things were good. I drove to Cambridge, most Sundays. I'd bring Timmy's for Meg, a tool or a little craft kit for Nora, and whatever small thing I'd spotted that week that seemed right for a baby. Trevor was fine, quiet, a bit stiff with me, but fine. I helped them when they needed it. When they bought the Cambridge house, Meg had called me in a panic because they were about $55,000 short of the down payment. I didn't hesitate. I transferred the money from a savings account I'd been building since Carol passed, money I'd set aside from the sale of a small rental property we'd owned together. I didn't ask for interest. I didn't ask for a formal repayment schedule. I asked Meg to hug me and told her I was proud of her. And that was that. Trevor shook my hand that day and said they'd pay me back within 5 years. That was 6 years ago. I'm not telling you that to be bitter. I'm telling you because it matters to what came later. I noticed the changes gradually. The way you notice the season shifting, not in one moment, but in the accumulation of small things. The first thing I noticed was that Trevor started being home more on my Sundays. Before, he'd often be out running errands or watching a game at a friend's place. But sometime in the 3rd year after Paige was born, he started appearing in the kitchen when I arrived, staying in the living room while I played with the girls, hovering in a way that didn't feel protective so much as supervisory. Then came the comments. Small ones at first, delivered lightly, almost as jokes. Gary. Nora's on a new sleep schedule. We're trying not to overstimulate her before nap time. We've been working on limiting sugar for Paige. Carol's cookies are great, but maybe just one. We're being more intentional about screen time, so the tablet thing probably isn't the best idea. Each one, on its own, was reasonable. Parents set rules. Grandparents should respect them. I understand that. I never pushed back. I adjusted. But the rules kept coming. And they kept multiplying. And the tone shifted from informational to instructional to something closer to corrective. Meg noticed. I could see it in the way she'd apologize with her eyes when Trevor spoke to me like that. She'd change the subject, or find a reason to bring the girls into another room, or give my arm a quick squeeze as I was leaving. She was managing both of us, and it was clearly exhausting her. I asked her about it once, quietly, when Trevor had taken Nora out to the car. "Is everything okay, sweetheart?" She smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "Everything's fine, Dad. You know how Trevor is." I did know how Trevor was. That was the problem. About a year after that conversation, he escalated. I showed up one Sunday in late January, I remember, because there was a freezing rain warning, and I'd driven carefully, and before I even got my boots off, Trevor was in the front hall with a look on his face I hadn't seen before. Not annoyed, not stiff, resolute. "We need to talk," he said. Meg was in the kitchen with the girls. I could hear Nora narrating something involving a stuffed rabbit. I straightened up and looked at him. "There are going to be some changes to the visit structure," he said. "Going forward, I need more notice before you come. Not a text the day before a week's notice. Minimum. And I need you to stop bringing things for the girls without clearing it with me first. Gifts, food, activities, everything goes through me." I took a breath. "Okay, I can do that. Also," he said, "I've been thinking about Meg's schedule and the load she's carrying. Your visits add to her stress, so I'm going to need to reduce them to twice a month instead of every week." I felt the floor shift slightly under me. Not rage, something quieter and colder than rage. "Twice a month," I repeated. "For now," he said. "We'll reassess." I said okay. I drove home in the freezing rain and sat in my truck in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. I called my friend Dennis, who's known me for 40 years, and I told him what happened. Dennis said something unprintable. I told him I understood the sentiment, but I didn't react. Not yet. The twice-a-month visits became less than that in practice. Trevor would cancel last minute. The girls were sick. They had plans. Meg was tired. February, I saw them once. March, I saw them twice. But the second visit, Trevor stayed in the room the entire time and watched me like I was a stranger at a bus stop. By April, I was averaging 5 or 6 hours a month with my granddaughters. Nora was 5. Paige was 3. They were at the age where they light up when they see you, where they grab your hand and drag you somewhere to show you something they discovered. But every time I arrived, I could see the awareness settling over them that visits with Grandpa had rules, that there was a kind of tension underneath the fun. Children know more than we give them credit for. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening in May. I'd called Meg to arrange a visit, and Trevor answered her phone. I didn't think much of it. I asked if I could come by that Sunday. He said Sunday didn't work. I asked about the following Saturday. He said he'd need to check. Then there was a pause. And then he said, "Actually, Gary, I've been meaning to bring this up. Meg and I have been talking, and we think it makes sense to formalize things a bit more." "Formalize things," I said. "The visits. We've put a lot of thought into this, and we think a structured arrangement would work better for everyone. Something that compensates for the time and energy it takes to coordinate and prepare." I was sitting at my kitchen table. I set down the pen I'd been holding. "What kind of arrangement?" I said. $3,000 a month, he said. "That would cover 2 scheduled visits Sundays, 3 hours each. You'd get 6 hours a month with the girls, first and third Sunday. In exchange, we'd stop the last-minute changes. You'd have guaranteed time. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't what you might expect. It wasn't rage. It was something closer to a strange, spreading calm, the kind you feel when the thing you've been half expecting finally arrives, and you realize you've been preparing for it without knowing it. $3,000, I said. A month. We both know you have the funds, Gary, and frankly, the girls are getting older. They have activities, they have schedules. Coordinating time for grandparent visits takes real effort. I said, I'll think about it. I set the phone down. Then I opened the drawer beside my kitchen table, the one where I keep the things that matter, old utility bills, the deed to the house, Carol's watch that needs a new battery, and I pulled out a folder I'd started putting together 3 months earlier, when I'd first started to feel the ground shifting under me. Let me back up for a moment. because I want you to understand something about how I got to that folder. I'm not a reactive person by nature. I grew up in a household where my father handled problems methodically. You assessed the situation, you gathered what you needed, and you acted when you were ready. He was a civil engineer, and he approached most of life's difficulties the way he approached a load-bearing calculation. Feelings were real, but they weren't the blueprint. When Trevor's behavior started escalating, I didn't talk to a lawyer right away. I talked to Dennis first, and then to my brother-in-law Paul, who had been through a difficult custody situation years earlier and knew more than most people about what options actually looked like from the inside. Paul was the one who told me about grandparents' rights legislation in Ontario. He told me to look it up, read it carefully, and understand what I was and wasn't entitled to before I spent emotional energy assuming I had no options. So I did. I spent 2 evenings reading through the Children's Law Reform Act and some legal commentary I found through the Law Society of Ontario's public resources. The law in Ontario allows grandparents to apply for access to grandchildren if that access is being unreasonably denied and if it's in the best interests of the child. It isn't automatic. It isn't simple. But it exists. I also called a family lawyer, a woman named Patricia, who was recommended to me by a colleague, and had a consultation. Not a full file, not a formal case, just a conversation. I told her what was happening, and she told me what documentation would be useful if things escalated. That was 3 months before Trevor made his proposal. So when I opened that drawer and pulled out the folder, it wasn't a snap decision. It was the result of quiet preparation. The folder contained a printed log I'd been keeping, dates, times, canceled visits, notes on conversations. It contained a printout of Trevor's text message to me from February saying visits need to be more limited going forward. It contained the original e-transfer record from 6 years ago, showing the $55,000 I'd transferred for the house down payment, along with a brief written acknowledgement that Meg had signed at the time, not a formal loan agreement, but something, and it contained the notes from my consultation with Patricia. I also, in the days after Trevor's phone call, drafted a short letter, not threatening, not legal in tone, just clear. I stated what had been happening, what I understood the law to allow, and what I intended to do if access continued to be restricted or monetized. I put the letter in an envelope, and I waited for Sunday. Trevor answered the door when I arrived. Meg was behind him in the hallway, and I could tell from her posture that she knew something was happening. She had the careful stillness of a person who has been told to let someone else handle it. The girls weren't in sight. I assumed they were upstairs. "Gary," Trevor said. Formal. "Ready." "Trevor." I stepped inside, set my jacket on the hook by the door, the way I always did, and held out the envelope. "I thought about what you said." I put together a response. He took it without saying anything. He opened it there in the hallway, leaning against the wall, and I watched his face as he read. The color didn't drain gradually. It left all at once, like someone had pulled a plug. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph acknowledged his proposal and declined it. The second paragraph referenced the Children's Law Reform Act by name, noted my documentation of the pattern of restricted access, and stated my intention to pursue a formal application for grandparent access through the courts if the current situation continued. The third paragraph referenced the $55,000 transfer from 6 years ago and noted that while I had never formalized it as a loan, I retained the documentation of the transfer and the written acknowledgement, and that I would be consulting with a lawyer about my options regarding that amount as well. I hadn't threatened anything, exactly. I'd simply shown him the shape of what I knew and what I had. He looked up from the letter. Then he looked at Meg. Meg was reading over his shoulder. She'd gone pale, too, but for a different reason, not fear, I think, but something closer to recognition. She'd known her father long enough to understand that I don't bluff and I don't perform. If I'd put something in writing, I meant it. "You hired a lawyer," Trevor said. "I had a consultation," I said, 6 weeks ago. "You've been logging our conversations." "I've been keeping notes since February." "Yes." He opened his mouth and closed it again. I said, "I don't want to go to court, Trevor. I want to see my granddaughters. I want to see them regularly, the way I have since they were born. I don't want anything else. I don't want money back. I don't want an apology. I don't want a big scene. I want Sunday mornings with Nora and Paige." I paused. "But I will protect my right to that. Clearly and legally, and for as long as it takes." He stood there for a long moment. Then Nora appeared at the top of the stairs in her socks, holding the stuffed rabbit, and called down, "Grandpa Gary?" I looked up at her. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. "Did you bring the cribbage cards?" I had. I always did. Trevor left the house about 20 minutes after that. He said he was going to a friend's place. He said it to no one in particular, put on his jacket, and walked out without looking at me. Meg and I sat at the kitchen table while the girls played in the living room. She had a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. I had a coffee I was. "How long have you been preparing for this?" she asked. "Since March," I said, "when the visits went to less than twice a month." She nodded slowly. She looked older than I wanted her to look, and tired in a way that goes past sleep deprivation into something more systemic. "Dad," she said, "I need to tell you something." I waited. "It's been like this with everyone, not just you. His parents haven't seen the girls in 8 months. His sister hasn't been over since Christmas. I thought it was a phase. I thought if I just—" She stopped. "I thought it would get better." I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. "It doesn't get better," I said quietly. "Not without something changing." She already knew that. She'd known it for a while. Sometimes you just need to hear someone say it out loud before you can let yourself believe it. I didn't tell her what to do. That wasn't my place. She was 34 years old, and this was her life, and her marriage, and her children, and she was the only one who could decide what came next. What I could do was sit there and be her father, and let her know that whatever she decided, she wasn't going to have to figure it out alone. We talked for a long time that afternoon. The girls drifted in and out. Nora taught me a card game she'd invented that had approximately 47 rules and no discernible win condition, and Paige fell asleep on the couch with her head in my lap around 4 o'clock. I stayed for dinner. Meg made pasta. Trevor didn't come home until after I'd left. The months that followed were not simple or clean or sudden, the way these stories sometimes sound when they're summarized. Meg started seeing a therapist in June, a woman who specialized in relationship dynamics and who, Meg told me later, used the word coercive in their second session in a way that made everything suddenly make sense. Trevor agreed to couples counseling, which lasted about 6 weeks before he stopped going. He said the therapist was biased. He said Meg was being manipulated by outside influences. He said, according to Meg, that her father had poisoned the well. I don't take pride in any of this. I want to be clear about that. There was nothing satisfying about watching my daughter navigate the unraveling of her marriage at 34 with 2 small children in the house. There was nothing enjoyable about the tension of that period, the uncertainty, the weeks where Meg would go quiet and I wouldn't push because I knew she needed space to find her own footing. In September, 4 months after the envelope, Meg asked Trevor to leave the house. He contested the separation initially. He retained a lawyer. The process was difficult and expensive and slow, the way these things always are. But Meg had documentation too. By then, she'd been keeping her own notes. She'd talked to her own lawyer. And the girls' school counselor had noted, in a report that became relevant later, that Nora had been showing signs of anxiety that had improved noticeably over the summer. The divorce was finalized the following spring. Meg kept the house. The $55,000 I'd provided was addressed in the settlement, not fully recovered, but acknowledged and offset in a way that was fair. My lawyer, Patricia, helped me understand my options there without making it adversarial. Trevor has supervised access to the girls every other weekend. He attends. Nora and Paige love their father, and I think that's appropriate, and I think it's a complicated and human thing that doesn't require a verdict from me. My job isn't to be the judge. My job is to be their grandfather. I see Nora and Paige every Sunday now. I pick them up at 10, bring them back by 5, and in between, we do whatever they want. Some Sundays, that's the farmer's market on Stone Road and lunch at the diner after. Some Sundays, it's my workshop, where Nora has been learning to use a handsaw on scrap wood with appropriate supervision, and Paige mostly contributes by organizing my screws into the wrong compartments and telling me it looks better that way. Nora turned 7 in October. She is meticulous and funny and has opinions about everything, including the correct way to stack firewood and why her stuffed rabbit, whose name is apparently Gerald, deserves more respect than he currently receives. Paige turned 5 in December. She is physically fearless and emotionally perceptive in the way some young children are. She notices things, files them away, and produces them later at unexpected moments. A few weeks ago, she looked up at me while we were raking leaves and said, "Grandpa Gary, are you lonely sometimes?" I said, "Sometimes, yes, but less than I used to be." She nodded like that was the correct answer and went back to the leaves. I have a photo of Carol on the shelf in my living room, taken at the cottage the summer before Nora was born, squinting into the sun, laughing at something I'd said that I can no longer remember. Some evenings I sit across from it and just exist in the same room as her for a while. I think she would have handled Trevor better than I did, honestly. She had a directness I sometimes lack. She would have sat him down inside the first year and named what she was seeing and told him plainly that it wasn't going to work long term, and he might have listened, or he might not have, but she wouldn't have waited as long as I did. Then again, I did eventually get there, just quietly, and in my own time. I want to end with something that I've thought about a lot since this all happened, something I think is worth saying plainly. What Trevor did, gradually restricting access, adding conditions, escalating demands, trying to monetize a relationship that should not have a price, has a name. It's a pattern of coercive control, and it doesn't only happen in romantic relationships. It can happen between in-laws and grandparents, between adult children and aging parents, between anyone where one person has decided to use access as a lever. And here's what I've learned, both from living through it and from talking to others who have. The instinct to stay quiet and accommodate, to not make waves, to tell yourself it will get better, that instinct is understandable. It comes from love, and from not wanting to make things harder for the people in the middle. But it can also, if you're not careful, become a form of slow surrender. You don't have to be loud to hold your ground. You don't have to be aggressive. You just have to be prepared, and patient, and willing to act when it matters. If you're a grandparent in Ontario, or anywhere in Canada, and you feel your access to your grandchildren is being unreasonably restricted, there are legal resources available to you. The Law Society of Ontario has a referral service. Family lawyers in every province can advise you on what options exist. You are not powerless, even when it feels that way. Document what's happening. Talk to someone who knows the law. Understand your rights before you assume you have none. And if the person restricting that access ever sits across from you and puts a dollar amount on your relationship with your own grandchildren, take your time, take a breath, top up your coffee, and then, when you're ready, hand them an envelope. Not with money inside, with the truth.